will share my screen here. Excellent. All good?
Okay, so wow. This one looks serious. And a couple of days before, PSN Instagram shared your posting about what you are going to talk briefly in your Instagram post, and oh, it looks like quite serious topics to deliver. And then please explain to us about everything that you need to explain. The time is yours, Elise.
Thank you. Okay, well, I will just jump into it then because for time constraints. So hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Massive thank you to the organizers. I know it's a lot of work to pull off, so thanks for having me as part of this. I also would like to do just a quick acknowledgement of country. I'm here in Meanjin, which is the traditional name for Brisbane in Australia, and I'm on the stolen unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. And it's really important that we do this acknowledgement of country for a couple of reasons. But first and foremost, because colonial violence and ongoing forms of white supremacy are, the farthest thing from punk, and it is our responsibility as people in settler colonial states like Australia and in North America, especially to continue recognizing the legitimacy of the true owners of the land and to be in solidarity with their struggles. So I just want to start off with a bit of an anecdote. So last year around this time, I was moderating a panel for PSN 2020, and I was in what was formerly our activist office. And on that day, my friend Sergio was released from prison. He's a climate activist. So I had been in court most of that day and during that week, and I was finally able to share a beer with him late that night, which was great. And the last few bands were playing on Zoom for the conference. It was just a great moment coming together. So 1 year later, I find myself writing this keynote speech super last minute, because the past few weeks have been really chaotic as usual. And not only due to my own solidarity projects, but because my friend Sergio, once again, has ended up in jail. And this time it's a lot more serious. So he was given a 1-year prison sentence for standing on top of a coal train in New South Wales, which is just south of me here in Queensland, disrupting the killer coal industry, which is incredibly destructive here in Australia and globally. As a result, there's been a lot of outrage among our activist networks, particularly here in Brisbane. We've been organizing a lot of protests to oppose that, resulting in more of our friends getting arrested and a lot of aggression by police. So when I was writing this, I was frantically trying to organize some banner painting sessions ahead of another rally. So I want to make 2 points with that anecdote. First of all, I'm sorry if any of this in my presentation will be mildly incoherent due to the rushed nature of writing. And secondly, that this is just part of the chaotic reality of being a dual activist researcher and a militant ethnographer. And I'm going to talk about that later. Because as I once lamented on my way home from the courthouse, this activism is really getting in the way of my PhD on activism. And that's one of the aspects I'd like to touch on, because I think it's important to reflect on form as well as content, especially when we're in social sciences like anthropology and sociology. But what I mainly want to talk about today is DIY and the manifestation of DIY in grassroots activist communities. And that's primarily over 2020-21, which of course is a pandemic context. So I finished all my data collection, and this is one of the first formal explorations of the research findings, but it's far from being exhaustive. The other part of my research is on gender and feminist care ethics, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit, but it won't be the focus today. And all of this plays out in a cross-cultural way because I've done interviews in Australia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So I'll try to emphasize the Indonesian part a little bit more for today, but I'll be talking about all 3 countries. So to give you just a bit of an overview, here's kind of what I want to talk about. DIY and grassroots, the model, the DIY careers, craftivism, mutual aid, radical self and community care, and militant ethnography, which is a lot of things. So yes, excuse me if I speak quickly. I will try not to. So linking DIY and grassroots. So grassroots activists have quite for a long time been using methods of direct action to mitigate for power from the bottom up, embodying principles of non-hierarchy, autonomy, participatory democracy in their organizing structure. DIY has been wielded in many grassroots activist spaces over previous decades as a fundamental ethos, shaping both the broader culture of the activist collective and specific practices of resistance. Despite its co-optation in capitalist rhetoric, DIY is still a really valuable tool today as an embodied form of political practice that rejects elitism, consumerism, neoliberalism, and so forth. A lot of the literature on grassroots activism from social movement theory tends to focus on success factors, messaging, outcomes, and a lot more qualitative research. And I'm a lot more interested in identifying elements of activist culture and practice from an anthropological perspective, and specifically the role that DIY plays in that as interpreted by people who actually live it. So if you take a look back and trace the lineage and diffusion of do-it-yourself kind of culture from the 1950s and 1960s, you see it kind of branch out into a lot of different counterculture groups, movements, music-based subcultures, and targeted political and social justice campaigns. So essentially that link between DIY and grassroots is absolutely not new, but we don't really talk about it that much in contemporary research or a rhetoric on grassroots activism. And that's part of the reason why I chose to focus on that for my PhD, which is a departure from my master's research, which was on punk communities across Java. And of course, there is overlap between political punk and grassroots activists, and I definitely don't negate at all the contributions of punk to activism and vice versa. But I wanted to look more at politics in practice and more frontline action rather than a more subcultural performance of resistance, which is more akin to punk. So I felt really inspired when I moved to Australia by the grassroots activists, especially in the climate movement to begin with, and wanted to look a bit more at them because there was so much embodiment of DIY in what they were doing. And when the pandemic hit, that flexibility and fluidity of do-it-yourself ethos was even more relevant to a study of grassroots activism. So in all of my interviews, I asked participants to tell me, what they thought about do-it-yourself, what they thought about grassroots activism. And I haven't really finished coding that part of my interviews yet, so I can't give you a full scope on this. But there's definitely some overlap just in the terminology that people use. So even here you can see how do-it-yourself is seen as a way to articulate messaging, really easy, so accessible. It's something in which people move collectively, the principles of openness, democracy, autonomy, solidarity, that emphasis on independence, and as well as a way to survive capitalism. Again, that thing of movement, so like actually moving, action, and being from the ground. So some of the kind of overall themes that come out of this are accessibility, autonomy, budget, community building and upskilling, messaging, strategy, sustainability. Although I do want to note a slight point of tension perhaps between the idea of independence and interdependence, which I think independence is more so articulated when talking about do-it-yourself, DIY, and that idea of independence, whereas interdependence is much more alluded to in conversations about grassroots. And I'm going to touch on that later as well. So just hold that in your mind. Okay, so I'm going to move on to this idea of DIY careers. So this is a concept from cultural studies that was developed fairly recently. And I'd like to just apply it and see how it works in the activist space, because it's typically used to talk about people in music industries or more creative industries. So the concept of a DIY career refers to a type of creative and fulfilling work activity that's engaged by young people, allowing them to maintain autonomy and authenticity. So again, autonomy, authenticity is these words that keep coming back. The DIY career path merits to be contextualized as existing within the broader youth precariat, so especially when facing a lot of financial instability these days for young people, primarily. So in this economy, the DIY career may be seen as a political decision to subvert capitalism, an ethic of resistance, or a trade-off which prioritizes community and selfhood over formal career trajectories. However, in exchange for all those great things, people must accept precarious living conditions and financial instability up to relative poverty. And so I could see that even just amongst the peers that I was working with in the grassroots activist space here in Brisbane. A lot of them were choosing to not engage in study or work, but rather be on Centrelink, which is like a welfare payment. So earning the least income possible, enough to survive, but not really earning much to be able to have the most flexibility possible in doing activism full time. So a more concrete example of this is in relation to the Kangaroo Point blockade, which was a grassroots refugee campaign and direct action movement that happened here in Brisbane over 2020. It's ongoing, but the blockade specifically was only in 2020. So it happened right after the start of the first wave of COVID here. And this all needs to be contextualized within the context of the pandemic, of course, because the pandemic opened a window of opportunity for some people to actually explore and engage with that DIY career. So the demographic of blockaders was mostly young people from 18 to 25, students, casual workers. A lot of them couldn't work anymore or had forgone their study. And they just got fully entrenched in this blockade lifestyle. Some of them ended up quitting their jobs or taking leave from the university in order to spend more time there. And for some people who had never done activism before, becoming full-time activists so quickly was quite a big shift. But they were able to do this in a lot of cases due to the pandemic conditions that had opened up. And so they were choosing that financial precarity and the general instability of the blockade, as well as that, that kind of social stigma of living on a blockade camp in the city over, routine and job stability. And it was also a way for them to align their practice with newfound politics. Now, I don't know how much this works in other countries, other contexts that aren't, Western countries like Australia, because the actual benchmark of financial precarity might be this model of DIY careers, activist careers, work in other places. We can talk about that later. So another thing that I want to mention is craftivism, and part of a broader conversation about DIY as a mode of production and consumption. And my hypothesis was, is craftivism a way for some activists to continue resisting more safely despite the more precarious landscape of COVID? So craftivism, or craft activism, is a subset of DIY culture that has roots in third wave feminism and civil rights campaign. It can be understood as a practice, a lifestyle, or community which deeply incorporates the principle of participatory democracy. And it is also needs to be understood as something that is inherently against capitalism and as such inherently political. So I wanted to look at some of the examples that came out of the different countries in my findings. In Brisbane, in Australia, I had one group specifically that continued to engage in craftivism throughout the first wave of COVID, and that was their main way to sustain any kind of momentum and visibility during that period of lockdown. So because they had always relied on DIY methods of production to create action props, banners, posters, and so forth, they were already self-sufficient during the harshest of the lockdown conditions. An accumulation of thrifted materials and random items picked up off the street or fish out of the dumpster could be used even when the shops weren't open. Street craftivism could be done individually or in a small group without jeopardizing the safety or the health of community. And like one of my participants said, it was an easy way for us to still contribute while also being COVID safe. And another saying that craftivism provides an interesting and safe way, especially for newer activists, to engage in movements without having to put their bodies on the line, especially to begin with. So that also brings me to this idea that maybe craftivism in the COVID context was a way to resist safely, but could craftivism also be a way to resist without putting your body on the line when you're in a context of an oppressive government regime, or where your practice as an activist puts you in jeopardy a lot more seriously than it would in, say, Australia. So in Indonesia, again, there's some great examples of craftivism. Again, lots of DIY banners, signs, props, costumes for actions. And beyond craft itself, a lot of theatrics and performance are incorporated into mass rallies and protests. And I'm sure a lot of you know this more than I do. You have Wangi from Bandung in front of the Gedung Sate and part of a rally, as well as toy strikes, shoe strikes, so things that are also performative that don't require people to be there on the ground as much or in the same way. You also have Needle and Bitch, which I'm sure a lot of you know from Jogja, who engage in DIY crafting as one of their main means of putting out their political message and to fundraise. And as well doing during the pandemic shifting realms. So for example, zine workshops, which are again a great way to engage in craftivism and engage in art-based resistance, but still doing it safely. So not only an art practice, but also shifting to the online space. In the Philippines, there are so many examples. I can't even begin to even conceptualize naming them all because they are absolutely incredible when it comes to creation and performance and art-based resistance. They do incredible amounts of letter patching, hand-sewn banners, hand-printed protest wear, even like radio shows. They do murals. They do incredible large-scale props and costumes for actions, and it's really amazing. So another thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea of mutual and doing it together. So again, taking that idea of independence and interdependence and this individualism that you kind of get from DIY and moving it more into a collectivism, which evokes more of a do it together. Because a lot of the groups that I talked to over the pandemic had to engage in more mutual aid initiatives during this time. So that became a really big part of what they were doing in their resistance. So the government's mismanagement of the pandemic really prompted them to do more caretaking among their groups, among their communities, which meant doing things to meet the basic needs. And a lot of this revolved around food security, and in these three countries, as well as agrarian justice. So some examples of these, we have in Australia, Growing Forward Guerrilla Gardens. This is again an example from Brisbane, which is a grassroots initiative that reclaims land to grow an array of vegetable and other plants. And the harvests are then donated either directly to people in need, such as recently resettled refugees, or are taken to an area like the social space, which is also a volunteer-run grassroots space in which they then prepare meals for community, which are also given out for free. We have the Deebing Creek Sovereignty Garden, which is a garden that's located on a First Nations occupation that is threatened by land developers. Is also an exercise in not only food sovereignty, but in like reclaiming land and self-sufficiency. And then of course, Food Not Bombs, which is across the board. In Indonesia, a lot of the feminist groups that I spoke with mentioned the importance of food sovereignty and agrarian justice. Again, not only had they been involved with local farmers' fights against development of their land, notably in Kulon Progo, but also supporting them, for example, with virtual markets to help them sell their produce, or making vlogs about food nutrition and the harvesting process of rice fields, which is an attempt to link feminist ideology and agricultural practice and then make it available to a wider public. So also an exercise in raising awareness. The Anarcho-Feminist Collective hosted workshops to teach local community how to do basic gardening. And during the pandemic, also participated in public kitchens for informal workers. And you see here an example from Espekinasi, which is also based in Jogja. And Food Not Bombs, of course, among other initiatives. In the Philippines, the most notable thing was the community pantry movement, which I hope you've heard of. Is a really great movement that exploded through social media, happening earlier on this year, and has kind of diffused into other parts of the world. The idea of being, leave what you can, take what you need. So really quintessential basic mutual aid. We also had the emergence of medicinal COVID gardens that not only provided food for people, but as well as medicinal herbs for those who might have been sick. And the Bungkalang movement, which is a great example of organized farmers from that movement, reclaiming land and also essentially doing like guerrilla gardening in certain areas, allowing them to survive the lockdown and provide for themselves. And also protesting, I guess, these issues of food security and land ownership in the process. So DIY, the great things that we know about DIY is that autonomy and that accessibility. But on the flip side of that, DIY can also mean further instability, and it can also mean that more personal resources have to be invested to make it work. And this is the same in the punk scene as well. Like almost in a way, the more DIY a scene is, the more difficult and challenging it can be to actually maintain and sustain it. So we focus a lot about how these grassroots groups, negotiate the causes and people outside of them, but how do they, sustain their community more inwardly, and how do they take care of each other and of themselves? And this is kind of this idea of radical self and community care, which we don't talk about enough. So I was really interested in seeing through this lens of feminist care ethics as well, how grassroots activists try to negotiate things like burnout, imposter syndrome, compassion fatigue, especially when they're facing rising repression, rising instability, all the additional challenges of the pandemic. So how do they do it, and what do they offer amongst each other, for themselves, and to an extent also to the broader community? And again, this highlights the interdependence among grassroots activists. So in Australia, a few examples would be, really briefly, watch house, court, and prison support. And so an overview of this is just always having people who can provide emotional support as well as handle the logistics for people who are going through those systems, being there afterwards to, do those emotional, welfare check-ins to make sure that they're doing okay, because it can be quite traumatic to go through those processes. Another great example was a community care team that I experienced at a Blockade camp earlier this year. So when you showed up, a community care team would greet you and walk you through a workshop about consent, about building good working culture, about the challenges of having addictions in a community space, about romantic relationships and the repercussions of that, and find people that you could talk to if you had any issues interpersonally in the group. And more broadly, and I think this is across the board, relevant in a lot of places, is the creation of support networks and virtual check-ins during the height of the pandemic. So a lot of people finding that, activism aside, just having people to check in with you and ask if you're okay and talk about your day with was key, not only to having that emotional support in the moment, but has created better cohesion and community building for grassroots groups that are still active today. In Indonesia, a great example that I would love to talk more about, but I won't have time, is this idea of committing to restorative justice. And this is something that requires a huge amount of emotional labor. It's a very difficult process to go through, but the idea behind groups who engage in restorative justice is to provide safety and a solution for someone who's been a victim of harm, and as well as the perpetrator of the harm. So they're trying to, really be true to an abolitionist and anti-carceral attitude by doing all that extra work to make sure that no one gets left out of community. So it really comes from a stance of care and compassion for community. A lot of examples of hotlines, counseling, virtual health, mental health sessions offered by groups, not only to the community, but amongst themselves. As well as, nope, I lost my page. Did I lose my page? Where did that page go? Sorry. It's on here somewhere. No, I don't know where it is. Okay, it doesn't matter. As well as this idea of gotong royong, which I think a lot of you would be familiar with, this idea tying it back to community and the importance of people just jumping into things when people need help. And that's something that is culturally very relevant to Indonesia. And I'm sure that you have a lot of examples of how that happens. And you see it as well in the punk scene a lot. So that is a great example that some of my interviewees talked about. In the Philippines as well, I really wish that I could find my page. Oh, it's right here. The practice of partaking in community or collective art is also seen as a therapeutic practice, and that maybe shouldn't come as a surprise because that is relevant in other places as well. but I was frequently quoted as being part of self-care and community care. The other thing that stood out was because a lot of the groups that I talked to focus on the peasant sector and the agricultural sector, is this need to actually go into communities and take over caretaking for women who want to be involved in political organizing. So having to do household chores and domestic work, as well as taking care of the children so that women can actually be involved in political organizing meetings. Something that I think we don't really think about as much when we think about self and community care. Another thing, again, a concept located in the vernacular locally is this idea of bayanihan, which again is this idea of coming together for a cause or helping out your peers when they need it. So again, rooted in this idea of community care, and that is local vernacular coming to the fore. So the last thing I just want to talk about before I wrap up, I'm looking at my time here and I'm probably close to 25 minutes, is the kind of the perils of doing militant ethnography. And this is a method coined by Jeffrey Juris in 2008 that is inherently collaborative and also, I guess, political, and aims to break down that divide between a researcher and their object, in this case, between the activists. So it means participating, quite fully in that as well. And so I am, quite immersed in grassroots activist organizing and a lot of solidarity work, and that has subjected me to a lot of ups and downs over the past 2 years. And it has prompted me to think a lot more profoundly about the impacts of research on the self and the importance of proactively addressing burnout, as a researcher and an activist. And, it can, as you can see, land you in some pretty precarious situations. So although it being a very rich method, it is not without its own ethical and logistical considerations. So that prompts, these following questions about how do we find ways to practice care for the self when the structures we exist within are not really conducive to that? How can we break down the power structures that we perpetuate? And how do we sustain ourselves in our research when we're maybe trying to fight the system that we operate within? Maybe not everyone, but definitely some of us. And so I would love to hear your answers if anyone has any about that. So far, the only thing that I've found very helpful is actually engaging in really meaningful, tangible solidarity work. And that's something that I think helps to balance those power dynamics, and also creates real rapport, especially during the pandemic. Not being able to actually be on the ground with people in Indonesia or in the Philippines is responding to a call for solidarity whenever there is one, and trying to do as much as possible to give back to those who have been involved in the research. It's also a way for me to put those two main aspects of the research into praxis. So putting do-it-yourself and putting feminist care ethics into praxis as much as possible. So this is my passion project, my side project, and it's rooted in the idea of community building, upskilling, autonomy, but also interdependence with others, and being able to actually raise funds for people who need them most, and doing that in not an optic of charity, but always of solidarity. And so to conclude, I wanted to just touch on these three words, these three kind of main themes of the conference: circuits, networks, connections, because I hadn't really incorporated them whatsoever into my presentation. The idea of circuits is a bit difficult because the word circuits involves coming back to a point of origin or some form of linearity, and I don't think that works very well with grassroots activism at all. I might be wrong, but that's just my thought. Whereas the idea of networks and connections, of course, is much more relevant. And I think it, again, highlights that idea of interdependence, that we don't exist really without our networks. We don't exist as isolated beings, and we need our networks and our connections in order to actually facilitate our own autonomy and our ability to act and to give care and to be involved with things. So that value of collaboration, which includes collaboration beyond borders, which is part of what we do with PSN and with other initiatives, is incredibly important. I think that's at the root of grassroots, and in a way of DIY or do it together. And so I'd love to hear if anyone has responses to any of this or has experiences of themselves being in grassroots activism. I'd love to to hear more about that. And any of my previous questions or anything that I've talked about, would love to hear your thoughts later. So yes, that is it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Elise. Well, wow, I'm overwhelming with the facts that, well, what she had presented before just actually explained what haptic says is that punk is a culture merely than a subculture. So I really like the fact that Alice tried to put on the focus on politics and practices more than the subcultural stuff. Like I think we have had enough with those punks who merely sings and dance in the intersection. But this one, all of these activities, that is the real punks, I think. Thank you, Alice, for the very blatant presentation. I hope it slaps some truth in everybody's faces right now, because sometimes that, well, all of those researchers, especially by no means to discrediting local researchers, but we have to learn so much from the foreign researchers, because they have this, I don't know, probably this one that they that you explain as a militant ethnography, because some of us tend to only capture the surface and not what is behind this whole surface. But this one, I think it can explain a lot of things to us. Thank you for the enlightenment. Okay.